I'm Laura Bonnell, and this is the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast coming to you from Detroit. Please subscribe and even rate and comment on our podcasts when it moves you. I learn something new with every podcast, and I'm always inspired by the people that are showcased here. We don't give medical advice. You need to connect with your doctor for that. I hope that this Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast educates you and sparks some volunteering or advocacy. The CF community needs people like you. Thanks to our sponsors, Viatris and Vertex, for their support. He's been arrested. Rabbi Mike Moskowitz has a wife and kids. He's an Orthodox Jew and one of the biggest supporters of the queer community. He is the scholar in residence for trans and queer Jewish studies in Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the world's largest LGBT synagogue. He is a deeply traditional and radically progressive advocate for the trans rights and a vocal ally for LGBTQ inclusivity. Rabbi Moskowitz received 3 ultra-Orthodox ordinations while learning in the Mur in Jerusalem and BMG in Lakewood, New Jersey. He is a Wexner Field Fellow, Senior Rabbinic Fellow at the Hartman Institute, and the author of many, many, many books that you can check out on his website. We met in person at Temple Shir Shalom in West Bloomfield. Rabbi Moskowitz was speaking at the synagogue, and I and some of my friends, we always want to be an ally for the queer community, and that is why we went, and he was fantastic. The CF community and every community does have a queer and a trans population, and that's why I felt it was important to talk about this. So welcome, Rabbi Mike Moskowitz. Thank you so much for coming on the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Let's first start off with the fact that you're an Orthodox rabbi and you have the largest queer synagogue in the world. And it's a very unlikely thing. So how did this happen?
It's a great question. So I am one of a team of rabbis. I'm the scholar in residence for trans and queer Jewish studies at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the world's largest LGBT synagogue. And it's interesting because I'm not trans and I'm not queer, which itself is another aspect of this. It started about 6 years ago when I was involved in an act of civil disobedience over DACA in the Senate Rotunda in Washington, D.C., and got arrested. And in the back of a police wagon, I met an incredible woman who turned out to be the senior rabbi of the synagogue. And I had been employed as a rabbi at Columbia University and of a synagogue nearby. But when I started doing this activism around LGBT issues, because somebody in my family transitioned, it became clear that it wasn't going to be a sustainable relationship, and found myself looking for work. And this rabbi, Sharon Kleinbaum, who spent time in high school, in an Orthodox high school and identified as an Orthodox woman, was really compassionate. And she and the congregation created a position for me to be able to particularly work at the intersection and the edges of the Orthodox world, which right now is kind of where most of these conversations are happening. When she wanted to go to rabbi school in the 80s, the Reform movement wasn't accepting lesbians. The conservative movement wasn't even accepting women. And now all of those movements have really gotten to a place of not just inclusivity and equality, but really representation and leadership. And it's just Orthodoxy's turn. And so she really felt that the world, beyond just me, but that the world could benefit from having somebody who, because of their own proximity to the LGBT world through their family, would be able to kind of give language from our tradition to be able to speak to these issues.
Your story is so beautiful. When I met you and heard you speak in person, I think we were all touched by it. You just saw something, and in equity, you saw that there needed to be more inclusion and more education, and you just did it. It shouldn't be something you have to be brave to do, right?
Right.
I mean, it should be normal, but you did it, and it wasn't and still isn't necessarily all well received, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, I see religion in general as a call to action, that because we believe in a higher power, we can do the right thing and end up in the right place. And so for me at that moment, it was really about how much faith do I have in the system of doing what's right and ending up in the right place. But yeah, it's still kind of shocking to me that at the time I was the sole voice. Now there are other voices at these junctures. but it's still not received as part of the kind of dominant culture. Although some of those lines have really shifted. The idea of asking somebody who's gay to marry somebody of the opposite gender, which was very common, 5-6 years ago, because people are no longer suffering in silence and that there's a choice to be able to be out in the broader world. Like, that's one of the edges that really has dramatically shifted. And I think particularly for like fundamentalist communities who feel like there is no place to move because we have a tradition and we know what's right. As soon as you can identify movement that's being accepted as like, oh, no, this is an important course correction. So then it's fair to ask, like, this is the only course correction, right? Maybe there are other things that didn't get perfect along the way, or like we have new information. And it's less about the tradition, really about the awareness of the reality of the world. And so I think that's a big part of this, is trying to understand the experiences of people that straight cis folks have a really hard time relating to. And I think that there's been a huge shift in the language also, like in the last 5-10 years, from the historical kind of really offensive ways of talking about an abomination or a perversion or a deviation, to being compassionate that like, okay, there's a struggle and we don't have all the answers, and like we have to figure out what a win looks like. And like there's like certainly a posture shifting. But yeah, there's still people who are in a place of just fear and hate, particularly those people who've never met somebody that they know of who's a member of the LGBT community, which is of course how, these things happen.
Right. And that's what I was going to ask you, because I just learned what cis, and that's CIS, what that means about a month ago. And if I'm correct, it means someone who is, I guess, straight, right? Is that correct?
It's a great question. I think it's a response to the word trans. So if trans means on the other side of like the transjordan or transition, right? So cis means on the side of. So it's the straight parallel for gender identity. So to say a little bit differently, gender identity and sexual orientation are different. Who a person is when they go to sleep is different than who one wants to sleep with. Someone who's asexual is not free from gender identity. So the straight person, which unfortunately kind of reinforces heteronormativity of like, this is the normal, and then there's somebody who's queer as the abnormal, right? Which is not what those words mean today. What the straight person is to the queer person, the cis person is to the trans person. So yeah.
And that's really important. And I want you to correct me this entire podcast because, no, it's really important. It's important to get it right. And it's important that someone corrects you. We just need to know. And I think as I continue to learn, one of the most frustrating things that I come across is when people say, I don't know, I just don't get it. Or that's just, I'm too old for this. Or it's too much. I can't remember the pronouns. Oh my gosh. I find that so offensive. And I know people don't mean it that way, but you need to care. You need to care that this trans community and the queer community, the gay community, and if you could also explain like LGBTQ, what queer embraces that one word.
Sure.
And then like the difference between gay and trans.
Yeah.
That would be really helpful to kind of start out.
Absolutely. And just thank you for caring, and thank you for giving people permission to say like, this is hard for me, but it's still important. Language in general is limiting. It's rarely as expansive as the experiences it comes to describe. And that's for sure true within the LGBT community. For example, let's say you have somebody who is in a non-heteronormative or a queer relationship. So let's say there are two women who are married to each other, and then one of them transitions to be a man. And so now they're presenting as a hetero straight couple. The person who is a lesbian and a woman might feel like her identity as a queer woman is being erased because she's now married to a man. Right. And so we don't have great language. Like, how do you describe that? That's a straight couple. That's a queer couple. That's not a straight, right? Particularly because the gender piece is different than the sexual orientation. Love is love, and two people can love each other, and the labels are less important. However, historically, particularly in my synagogue community, it started as a gay community, really for just gay men, two men who like each other. And then that extended to also include people who were bisexual, in that they were attracted to both men who were attracted to both men and to women, and women who were attracted to both women and to men, lesbians who are, to women. The optics around systemic change has always come faster or been better received around two women, in part because I think men who are straight and heterosexual can imagine being attracted to a woman, like women are attractive, right? I'm straight. And so the idea that two women are attracted to each other, like, okay, that makes sense. I like women. Why wouldn't women like each other, right? And there's something like male heteronormative centric about the process where like guys seeing two guys being together be like, oh, that's so weird. That's like, how do you like a guy without kind of the awareness? Well, if you want to be with a woman who likes you, she needs to like a guy, right? So like it's all hard, like an extra step. And so like the first cases that really came to the Supreme Court were like older lesbians because people felt less threatened. There's a lot in general, the things which are closer to straight folks, which is one of the reasons why right now there's been so much success around getting rabbis in particular not to officiate weddings when they know the guy is gay, because that also affects straight people, right? Because that's somebody's daughter. And you wouldn't want somebody who is not to be married to somebody that you care about, right? Who couldn't find that person attractive. So when it comes to the kind of the original flag, it was really a gay flag. It was a pride flag. Gilbert Baker had 8 colors having nothing to do with gender identity, sexual orientation. It was really about qualities he thought were good for the world and to be a healthy, happy person. It was very evidently expensive for 8 colors to be dyed, so it got down to 6. But that's a really great example of how the flag continues to shift, right? That then include people of color and intersex and there are issues around disability and other things that have become kind of marginalized segments of society becoming kind of collected together, which is both a service to recognize, the intersectionality, as it were. It came a phrase, I think, in maybe the late 80s or 90s, a woman who recognized that there were certain, it was a particular company where women of color in particular, were not advancing. But it was hard because there were women who were white who were advancing and there were men of color. So it wasn't a person of color or a woman thing, but at that intersection of a woman of color, right? So that's the intersectionality. That's where the term came from. And that's true today around bathroom access and people who use wheelchairs and people who are gender queer. So the word queer is an umbrella term, and it can mean queer, gay, lesbian, bisexual, all sorts of other sexual attractions beyond kind of the straight, narrow one man, one woman. And then around gender identity, transgender is generally the binary of from male to female, female to male. There are people who are gender queer or non-binary or gender fluid, and that's a recognition of things that exist between those two poles in gradations. For some people, it's fixed. For some people, it's an awareness of both genders. For some, it's an absence, right, of an awareness of either gender. And so gender queer is that umbrella category to include all of that. So when we think about what it means to be gay, what it means to be straight, that's, again, the sexual orientation piece. And these are not parallel lines, because what it means, what a society constructs is this is what it means to be male, this is what it means to be female, right, that determines all of the other things. And so we've made an observation, the early wave of the modern trans experience was really predominantly 3-to-1, male to female. Now, in many places, it's really the opposite. The space of gender queerness is expanding, in part because there's a growing awareness that once a person's body is not the indicator of gender identity, meaning whatever a person's body was when they were born with it, once we recognize that that's not the source of the gender identity, why then try to, kind of curtail or adapt the presentation of the body to then conform it to fit to something that really is not so essential. So for some people, the presentation being seen as who one really is really essential. For others, there's greater comfort in just saying, actually, don't look at my body as a way of looking at like who I am. Who I am is much deeper.
And I think that's a great explanation, and thanks. And hopefully that helps people. But as you know, there's still like people focus in on bathrooms.
Yeah.
Not about the fact that this group of people is being assaulted, discriminated against, but that they might use a bathroom that they go to. How do you calm somebody or talk to them or make them understand,
Sure,
that this isn't like the big issue?
Yeah, I mean, bathroom access is really important, and everybody needs to have safe bathrooms. The way in which safe bathroom access, there are problems in the way in which most American bathrooms exist. Like everybody in their own home has all gender bathrooms, right? Because that's how every human in America functions. If they have a bathroom in their house, it's open to everybody. So it's not like it's a complicated idea. Like it's actually often the first bathroom we're ever accustomed to. But for example, if a parent takes their child to a movie theater and the child needs to go to the bathroom, there's an age where they're too old to go into the gender of the other parents, but they're also too young to go by themselves, right? So like the current structure, even as it affects straight people, particularly around children, like everyone should have safe access. So I think we need to be more intentional in the way in which we create bathrooms. I think single occupancy bathrooms are trending in, that you'll have now like family bathrooms and in my synagogue, all of the bathrooms are all gender bathrooms. And simply what that means is like there's collective sinks and mirrors, but then there's just a wall with different rooms, right? That each, instead of a stall, it's a separate room. So I don't think it's a complicated, kind of idea. It just requires a little bit more intentionality. But ultimately, what trans and genderqueer folks want is the safe kind of access to the bathroom, which is what we all want. And it also, that those fears around the trans piece is really also, it reinforces heteronormativity, right? It assumes that everyone who's going into the men's bathroom is only attracted to women, right? Which is like a very strange, like, lack of awareness. And so statistically, a person of trans experience or someone who's genderqueer is exponentially more likely to be the subject of hate, God forbid, than to be the perpetrator of it. But it's not about statistics, right? One of the things that we know about phobias is that it's detached from reality. It's not about the facts. It's about people's feelings. And it's often those feelings which are uninformed by the reality of the world because of the separation and the lack of proximity.
I'll say this several times in this podcast, but this is why I told you in person. This is why I love you. And this is why you are a fantastic messenger, because you are giving out information in a way that hopefully isn't alienating people. You're giving out information and nobody's trying to hurt anybody.
Right.
You're just trying to educate. And I saw when we were at the speech at Temple Shir Shalom that people were receiving what you were saying in a different way. And that's when I said, I think you should go into politics. But
Thank you.
We don't have to go there. But I was just like, I love your presentation of the information because I think you do it beautifully.
I think part of the combating dehumanization is to show how much more similar we are than different. And actually what I want is, I think, the same what everybody else wants, right? I also want people to wash their hands when they go to the bathroom. Like that's a value. And like,
right.
So for people who are still struggling with this, if you can just imagine what you want for yourself to feel taken care of and protected and safe, so just extend that to every other human, right? Like that's not complicated. I think that's why the verse really frames it like, love your neighbor like you love yourself. Like you might not know who your neighbor is, but like, you know what you want. And so just imagine that they also want similar things.
And I think the pronoun thing, I know people are still confused, and I work on it every day because I'm talking to so many different people, and I try to be very conscious of it. But one of my kids was telling me, Mom, you don't say she, her for yourself. You're saying it for someone else. So you're normalizing what pronouns mean. And I was like, oh my gosh, I get that. It's so like, I heard this guy in a plane who was in HR, which I still can't believe he was in HR. And he was saying, well, we're having a group meeting, and if the queer people want name tags for their pronouns, they can do name tags. None of us are going to. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so rude, to say the very least. Like, why wouldn't you just normalize it? Everybody wear a name tag. So what are your thoughts on all of that?
Sure. I think there's something really broken in society, obviously, that there's a need for people to push up against dominant culture, against transphobia and homophobia. And whenever we react or we're responding to something that isn't working well, there's often unintended consequences and side effects, right? The same thing is true with medicine. But when the ailment is so acute, we justify it because the alternative is much worse. So not sharing one's pronouns, right, contributes to the erasure of the trans and genderqueer experience. That being said, there are some unintended consequences of hyper elevating and focusing on gender. Of all the things I want you to know about me, he, him is not in the top, 100 in terms of my identities. But it's actually not about me, right? It's about me using the privilege that I have as a commodity, leveraging it, using it as a currency to say, like, there are people who are suffering. I'm in a position to alleviate some of that by doing this thing that doesn't really cost me anything. And maybe it's a little bit awkward that hi, my name's, Mike Moskowitz, my pronouns are he, him. But like, that's the trade-off. And so maybe I shared this there, but when I was doing a book talk with somebody who's trans and it was on Zoom, And before we went to the kind of the public discussion, he saw that on my Zoom screen, it had my name, my pronouns, and he's trans. And he said, I should probably put my pronouns there. But I had some really expensive and painful surgeries in order that I shouldn't have to tell you what my pronouns are, right? And I present as I present, so I don't have to say, hey, I'm a guy. So it's really person specific. And so I don't think that we should ever kind of, and I don't think it's successful to try to fiat attitude and try to tell people how they need to think and feel and act. But I do think that there's an opportunity as an invitation to put oneself out there as somebody who cares about these issues, not because I am worried about myself being misgendered. I've never, people assume I'm queer or trans all the time, but nobody has ever thought that I was a woman that I know of. So it's not for me, but it's me who's being part of humanity. And so it also continues to evolving, and I don't think it's going to last forever the way it is now, because very few things do. There was a stage where people were using the word preferred before, like my preferred pronouns are. And for some people, it's a preference. Like they might be genderqueer that skews masculine, so it's he, them, or so I prefer he over them, but either will work. But for me, my pronouns he, him, it's not a preference, right? Call me she, her. I'm not going to respond because I'm not going to think that you're talking to me. So there's no substitute for relationship building. And so if a person is in relationship with the people for whom this affects, being able to say, my intentions here are just to be supportive. And maybe for you, that means, bringing awareness to it. And for others, not, because forcing someone to share their pronouns, let's say their pronouns are they, them, and they don't feel like it's a place where they can be out as genderqueer. So forcing people to share their pronouns. So I think in general, intimacy is really best framed as an invitation, right? When you're asking somebody to share something that's private. So you can invite them to, and then wait for that kind of enthusiastic consent for them to come into that space. So in general, I say, my name is and my pronouns are, and anyone who wants to share can. But this is not about judging people for or not. People have a lot of reasons in either direction.
Great advice. Tell us how big your congregation is and kind of what the feeling and what happens in your synagogue.
It's a unique experience. It's not affiliated with any of the movements, which itself is very rare. It started in 1973, so it's now it's begun its 51st year. They've only had one senior rabbi since it started. She's now in her 32nd year, and she's retiring and in a few months, which is sad because it went from, having her and a part-time staff member. I think we have close to 30 people in staff now. So it's relatively large. It's right by Penn Station. It's at 30th and 7th. We have 3 floors. The main services during the week is a Friday night service. But the main service for the year is on the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. They rent out the Javits Center in New York City, and thousands of people show up. They don't charge for tickets. It's really been a place, a safe place for people to be out. When it first started, it was illegal to be gay. You couldn't be served alcohol. There was all sorts of horrific legislation. And also in the early 70s, there wasn't a single Jewish institution or leader or rabbi or organization that said it was okay to be gay. And so this was really the only place for young gay Jews. They were mainly young, but to really be out as both their Jewish identity, with their Jewish identity, their queer identity, which still today in Orthodoxy, the big shift now is that young people are choosing not to choose between a religious identity and a genderqueer identity. And they've stayed put. And now, when it first started, people asked, how can you have a gay synagogue? And now people want to know, why is it even necessary? The modern LGBT movement just, from Stonewall is just a little bit more than 50 years old. So it's incredible to see the change and to know that it does get better, but it only gets better when people put in the effort. And so it's an incredible space. One other thing that I think really marks it as a distinct Jewish space is its commitment to joy as both spiritual practice and political resistance. And during the AIDS epidemic, which is when Rabbi kind of came on, 40% of the congregation died from AIDS.
Wow. And
there wasn't a Sabbath where there wasn't somebody who was in mourning, somebody who themselves was dying. It used to be a death sentence, 6 months, a year, or somebody who was really kind of preparing somebody for what was going to be an early passing. But they carved out space and really expanded the heart space to be able to continue to hold joy, even in those really dark times. And it's something that Rabbi Kleinbaum and the community leans into in difficult times like today. We're living in really difficult times. and being able to find joy and to chase the joy and to be nourished during the Sabbath, to be able to then go back into the work week with a renewed sense of purpose and resources is something that really has created a space of not just being able to advance the cause, but to be able to do it in a way that feels joyful and proud. And it's really powerful to witness.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. So I don't want to forget to ask you about the prayer books that you have there that people can order. Tell us about the prayer books that you have in your synagogue.
Yeah, so it's because it's a unique space. And to be clear, it's not an exclusive or orthodox space. The clergy team has representation from all of the different leadership movements. We've had, I think, about 25, 26 years of interns from different rabbinical schools. So we have more than 50 interns also who now are themselves deans of different seminaries. So the prayer book is something that was created by the synagogue itself, and it has some of the more traditional liturgical components, but also has poems and rituals in there that are queer specific or gender queer specific. The prayers around HIV, name changes for people who transition. And it really kind of, I think, reflects the culture that when you have a synagogue that is unified around, gender identity or sexual orientation. Right now, about 80% of the community identifies as queer, which again has been a term that used to be a pejorative, but now has been reclaimed. And about 20% is not queer or straight. The political pieces vary, the perspectives on Israel vary. And so this is really, it's a very God-centric place. Rabbi Kleinbaum preaches from the pulpit about God and God's love and the faith and the optimism that being in partnership and relationship with God can afford. Spiritual community. So it's a God-centric prayer book, which also acknowledges that not everybody there believes in God. And so there are alternative meditations and invitations for people to think about things in those moments. One of the things that the synagogue does really well is recognizes that not everybody has the same access or abilities or orientations. And in many synagogues, certainly when I was growing up, the rabbi would say, please rise. And then others, then shifted to please rise if you're able. And at CBST, and it's not the only place that does this, but, please rise in body or spirit, right? Because we want everyone to rise, but what that means is very different for different people. And so there's a deep sensitivity to accessibility in all different ways, both people who have special needs for the Sabbath in terms of being accessible. There are places to sit where you're not going to be on video. There are places to sit. There's a balcony for people, there are places if a person wants to pray separately, there are places but the default is that kind of everybody's welcome to all the places. And for example, the way in which we talk about keeping kosher there, right? There are things which are certified kosher. In Hebrew, it has a hechsher, and things that don't have a certification. But for some people, their definition of this is kosher, this isn't kosher is not the same definition. So we're free from judgment, right? We speak about it in a technical way. This has supervision. This is not supervised. And then people make their own choices. So I think there's a lot that the non-queer community can learn from the queer community, particularly around language of God. The divine revelation I see is like God's coming out speech. We've now forced God back into the cloud, said God is hidden because it's an unsafe space for God to be out as God's self because of the way in which we treat other people. And these are universal things, not unique to Judaism. But I have found that the way in which I am able to relate to things beyond the queer community have been deeply informed by it.
Not to sidetrack, but it's a little sidetrack. But I wanted to ask you something that I talked to you about before was, is there a contradiction? Because a couple of people asked it after you talked that in the Orthodox Jewish, and maybe it's partly a stereotype, you'll set me straight, but if men cannot shake a woman's hand and things and separation of men and women in the synagogue, in the Orthodox religion, is there any controversy or did I get it wrong?
No, I think you're right that it's controversial. Judaism is a gender-based spiritual practice, and different movements have narrowed the space of the differences between men and women who can lead certain parts of prayers, was counted in the quorum, etc. But at its core, it's a gender-based spiritual practice. And so I think reasonable people can disagree about what's essential, right, about being a woman. Getting paid 70 cents on the dollar, right? These are things which we can acknowledge. It's much easier to exclude something than it is to kind of... So I think within Orthodoxy, and certainly in my worldview, that gender primarily exists on a soul level, and that we're created an image of a God that doesn't have an image, but God has gendered attributes. God doesn't have a body. And I see the commandments as really kind of engaging on a soul level, different aspects which are sourced in different parts of gender. So people can disagree, but I think that for me, seeing spaces as being segregated around gender, for some people, I can acknowledge and find it offensive because it's segregation. And for others, particularly for trans folks, many have said it's so affirming that even the space validates my gender identity, right? A person who's assigned one gender and might not present with clarity to the world and that they're perceived as, now can come to a space where like, this is the women's section, this is the men's section. And that for some people is deeply healing. So like with all things, right? For some people, it's deeply healing, for others, it's deeply offensive. People should, do what they think makes the most sense. But I have heard criticism from folks that like, as a woman, I can't get called up to the Hebrew Bible, but if I would transition to a man, then I could. Like, isn't that some sort of... So, and I think, one of the things that's shifting within many parts of Orthodoxy is there's a recognition that what society has claimed to be essential is actually a social construction. And so women being rabbis, women having leadership roles, women studying different things, like all of that is shifting. And it parallels, I think, what we're seeing in the secular world as well. We used to describe women's reproductive rights that way. And then we realized that not every woman has a uterus, not everyone with a uterus is a woman. And then it became reproductive rights, right? So as we learn better, it become more precise with language. I think that's happening within Orthodoxy as well. Certain things which we thought were really healthy, like smoking cigarettes, turns out not so much. And so then Jewish law, right, then reflects that actually you shouldn't start smoking cigarettes because it's not good for you. So it's not that Jewish law changed, it's that our understanding of reality changed. And so as we come to better understand the trans experience and these things, I think we'll get closer to the truth. But that's the dance of trying to get like the science of it right and the tradition of it right. If you get either one of them wrong, you're not going to end up in the right space.
Right. And again, I do want to stick to our topic, but I have to say too, other religions like the Christian religion, Catholic religion doesn't allow women priests. Like there's a whole bunch of things. And there's movement and slow change everywhere. So thank you for answering that and sharing that. It's very helpful. And just let's talk a hot second about your wife, because she's doing amazing things.
My wife's the best.
And is an exceptional human as well.
Yeah, my wife, we could talk forever. She actually has a birthday coming up this week. It's very exciting. Yeah. So my wife teaches at Maharat, which is a seminary for Orthodox women to give ordination. People get to choose their own title. Some people use the term rabbi or rabbah, Maharat, but it's really important in filling the space. These are often like highly educated women where this is like a second career. Many of them are professors in universities. Many of them, went and graduated with honors from Ivy League universities. And, I studied in the two largest yeshivas seminaries in the world for over a decade. My wife is much smarter than I am. My wife is much more talented and can really, she learns differently because she's a different person, texts, but she learns much better. And one of the things that I think, one of the many kind of narratives that we've acknowledged are false is like the capacity of women to be in certain places, right? Women have only been able to vote in this country for 100 years. And, even when I was born, which is not that long ago, like women couldn't always get credit cards. Like there's been a lot, and even still, there's no real equality in pay. Like there's still a lot. We haven't had a woman president. Like there's still a lot of spaces, a lot of ceilings that exist. But my wife went to Harvard and graduated with honors for undergrad, and then went to Harvard Law School. And as part of when she was there were a whole bunch of young Jewish aspiring leaders that have now really deeply impacted the Jewish world in America and in Israel. From those years that she was there, but she gets tremendous pleasure, particularly in studying with young girls who are fortunate enough that they have role models. When my wife was young, there were no female scholars, there were no women doing this work, and so then they filled that void. And then now, those who come after will fill the next void. But it's also something that I think we try to model some sort of commonality of individuality. She and I are very different people, and we acknowledge the autonomy that each one of us needs to have in our own spiritual practice. But the fact that we're different doesn't mean that we don't co-occupy space really well, that we don't share passions and advance the cause of goodness in ways that are very different. What she thinks is the ideal kind of universe is not my vision, although my vision includes, spaces for people, obviously, of her vision. So it's I feel really blessed to be in a relationship with somebody in the world of ideas who challenges me. But like the source of love and connectivity is not the fact that like we get to the same conclusion about everything.
Well, and thank you for telling us about her. I appreciate it. And getting back to your synagogue, so there's a lot of anti-Semitism, as you know, and then you've got the hate, that's out there against the trans community and the queer community, and you have both in one house. So is there concern for safety, or how is that going, in New York?
Yeah.
In the synagogue? It seems like it might be a little scary.
It's a lot scary. Anti-Semitism is very real. As irrational as it is for me to understand, why our Jews hate it so much, it's definitely real. Walking in the streets of New York City, going in the subway, something as somebody who presents as Jewish, it's something that
And for someone who doesn't know, you wear a black hat, you have a beard, you've usually, is it always a black suit? In my memory, it is, yes. And the tallis hanging out of the bottom of, people can see. It's very obvious.
Yes. I'm very out as an Orthodox Jew. And certainly the people in the streets of New York City know that I'm Jewish in the way in which I present, because they say offensive and silly things. And it's annoying. It's draining. When I get off of the subway, I have to pay attention much more now than I did even, before October 7th. In general, you have to pay attention. But, does it feel safe to walk around with headphones or, listening to a lecture or being distracted, as opposed to being really proactive of, and that's draining. It's not even a microaggression, right? It feels like it's a heavy weight do I even want to go on the subway today? Because then I have to, to deal with all the stupidity. So that's true in the anti-Semitism piece. And the anti-Israel piece is complicated because it is different than the anti-Semitic piece. Israel within the trans and genderqueer world has, for reasons I don't fully understand, there's been a big shift and split within the, kind of the LGBT world around Israel. There are a lot of trans and genderqueer folks who align with anti-Zionism as a movement. The synagogue does not boycott Israel, and it identifies as a progressive Zionist organization. And now we get boycotted sometimes from people who feel like our position is not aligned with theirs. It skews generationally, that it's generally younger people who are in those positions of aligning with anti-Zionism, anti-Zionist places. But there are queers all over the world. It's just part of the reality. There are queers among the Palestinians, and some of them are finding support within their communities, the way in which other communities which are slow to get there are making progress. But as a default, it's not, Islamic states in general are not particularly progressive or inclusive. And there are many places in the world that really it's a crime, right, to be out as gay still, and people are killed over their sexual orientation. So if there was a community that we would expect to be more nuanced, to break the binary and the false narratives of the binary, it would be the genderqueer community. But we're just not seeing that. We're seeing that there's an oversimplification of oppressor and oppressed, good versus evil, weak and strong. And the truth is never, it's not so simple. So it's certainly an ongoing conversation of what Jews all over the world, what's the right space? What does it mean to be the right type of Jew in this moment? I think it just means doing the right thing and being Jewish while doing it. But what it means to do the right thing is also not complex. It's not so simple. So yeah, those intersections now make it just exhausting, is the short of it.
Wow. But you are having those conversations in the synagogue, so that is good.
Yeah. And it's important to talk about these things, particularly when we don't know the right thing to say, right? What's the right response to somebody who, if they really would be out in those places, would be, killed. But there are a lot of innocent people suffering. That's real. And we pray for all those who are in harm's way. I mean, we don't distinguish between good people anywhere.
And the link to your synagogue is in our show notes. So anybody that wants to either go there or find the prayer books or your books or anything like that, it is in show notes. I also wanted to ask you about not everybody who's trans is having surgery.
That's correct.
I know a lot of people think everybody who's trans is having surgery. And one of the reasons I think that it's important that because every community has somebody who's either trans or gay or whatever, the cystic fibrosis community for sure, right? And I think if you're getting a port and maybe you're transitioning, that could be very sensitive. So if you can talk about the fact that some people may be deciding to do a trans surgery, others may not. Is it just hormone blockers or things like that? Like, how does that all work?
Yeah, it's really person specific. There's no one way to be trans. For some people, it's a function of a haircut, maybe a name change, maybe a wardrobe change. For others, not. For some people, it's hormones. For some people, it's surgery, and there are different types of surgery. Some people have top surgery. Some people don't, and they use a binder, like a chest compression apparatus. Again, I think the genderqueer space is expanding. I know some people who have transitioned who didn't change their name, and their name is not an ambiguous name. It's a name that codes for the world as one gender or the other, but that's the person's name and they don't want to change it. And so it's just, with medicine now, and it also depends when a person transitions. If a person transitions, let's say before puberty, it's a different set of choices often that people make. If it's after, then, it's a different set of choices sometimes. So the most important thing to do is to be supportive. There's no one way to do this. Certainly, Judaism has thoughts on surgeries which a person might not need. But also when we think about, does a person need this? When a person says, Rabbi, you don't understand, I can't live like this, right? That's a real need. It's not just in somebody's head. I did write an article for Brandeis University with the head of the transgender clinic at Mount Sinai. It's called The Rabbinic Prescription for Trans Healthcare. It's not a particularly long article, but, we would never say to somebody who has a hole in their heart, God forbid, that like, well, God made you this way, so like you can't intervene. As rabbis, we get a lot of questions, doctors get a lot of questions, and this world's broken and people's bodies are often in need of repair in different ways. And we feel Jewish tradition puts a huge emphasis on doing whatever we can to keep people healthy. And what that means right now within the science-based medical community for trans healthcare is the best response is to be supportive of the individual. And so depending on where the person is in terms of their set of needs, so then we're here to be supportive. It's also important to recognize that Judaism puts an emphasis on the preservation of life, but our goal is not just to get people to that moment before the brink of, I can't live like this, right? Trans lives matter, but also the lives that they live matter. And so it's a quality of life issue, and it's a human dignity piece. I think as adults, particularly when we deal with trans youth, we want to be supportive without being influential. The more that we can listen and listen deeply, the more that we can have experts, medical experts, mental health experts, the stakes are really high. But inaction is also a choice. And so even though as rabbis, we always try to get out of the question because then you don't have to take on, the responsibility of getting it right. There's really no way to avoid answering the question. If a person is trans and they don't transition, there are consequences. If a person is trans and they transition is a different set. And so particularly in adolescence, it's a time of transition. They're going from being a child to being an adult. Parts of their brains are just more developed than others, which is why we don't let them get tattoos or do other things that have consequences, right? And so the stakes are really high. But what I think is really important to kind of name is that it's always complicated. Even in the simplest of cases, it's complicated because at the end of the day, we're relying on somebody who's young. And questions around fertility have really severe stakes attached to them. And not doing anything is also a choice and can have really deleterious effects and, God forbid, really kind of permanent effects by not doing something. So the most important thing to do is to take it seriously, to listen, to get the support and the help, to really explore to the extent possible where it's coming from, how much of this is internal, how much of this is external. And like in life, we make choices all the time around relationships. We're not going to know what it's like to be married to somebody for 10 years until we're married to them for 10 years, right? But we do some due diligence and get as many data points as we can that feel like we can make an informed decision, and we can't obsess too much about the outcome in the future because we're not prophets. We don't know what's going to be in the future, but we're really taking the responsibility to listen and to find the support that particularly young people need. And it's really important.
And is this correct that people who transition to either a man or a woman, because a lot of people talk about, oh, then they're going to regret their choice. I think the statistic isn't less than 1% of the people who have had surgery regret it. So this isn't a huge number.
Yeah, there was a new study yesterday that I think the base of people that they interviewed was 90,000. Of the 90,000 people, I think fewer than 100. So it's less than, it's a lot less than 1%. And again, I think it's in my mind, it's not about, well, what's going to be 20 years from now? Because nobody knows what's going to be 20 years from now. But in this moment, like, what's the right choice to be making for this person? Keeping in mind, the consequences, but not everybody's going to live 20 years if they're not listened to. And so it's tricky. It's super tricky, but we have to make the most informed decision as people who are responsible for young people. But in terms of, the statistics historically, and again, there's not tremendous data, right? Because we don't have this going back 100 years.
Right.
But we all make choices. And here, I think it's a really safe choice to listen, with experts in the field, to really listen, to explore where this is coming from. And if a person acknowledges that the trans experience is real, so then it's not complicated. If a person feels like none of this is real and it's all some sort of mental health issue, so then it doesn't make a difference what the data is. Everybody comes across as not being well. So I think part of this is acknowledging the reality, particularly, and Dr. Joshua Safer writes, he did a documentary with Katie Couric for National Geographic, I think it's called something like The Gender Nation, where he goes through kind of the science of the trans experience. One of the proofs that he brings is if somebody is an identical twin and they're trans, there's a 40% chance that the identical sibling will also be trans. But if they're not identical twins, so then it's the same as the national average, which makes it sound like it's much more on a kind of a genetic level. And he has a few other proofs. But at the end of the day, to be a rabbi, you need to have humility. To be a doctor, you need a lot of humility. We don't have all the answers. We don't know the future. But we can't separate ourselves from like the urgent ask of the present.
And this is something that as a toddler that they might know. We've heard as young as 3 or 5 years old on both the trans and the gay, as far as, trying to figure out who you are.
Yeah, it's obviously it's person specific. Some people find out much later in life after marriages and after other things.
Of course, yeah.
But I would say as in terms of trends, generally speaking, a person becomes more aware of gender identity before sexual orientation, generally, because a person's gender identity exists independent of sexual orientation. So most 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds aren't like sexually aware of attraction in that way. And so it makes sense that, for some people, they always knew that they were gay because they saw gay people like, oh, this is me, right? Even though that, but for trans folks, it's not uncommon at all. 5, 6 is not uncommon. 3, 4 happens, right? But it's not at all uncommon for a person. One, for cis people, for people whose gender identity kind of aligns with the way in which they were assigned at birth, we're told which gender we are when we're a kid and told which bathroom to use. And like, it doesn't bother us. And like, we don't think about it again. Like it is what it is. But for people who are trans and have an awareness of gender beyond their body, so then often at those early intersections, like, well, why are you telling me to go into this bathroom? I'm not a boy, I'm a girl, or I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. Like, why, how come you don't know that about me? And there's often a tremendous simplicity from the individual. Like, I just am. Like, it's not complicated. And I think for many adults, the space between, like, what are you saying? I don't understand any of it, right? I can't gain any sort of traction. And the simplicity for trans folks to say, like, it's like, actually, it's not complicated. So I think in evolved spaces to get to a place where for cisgender folks to say like, okay, yeah, I now know what I don't know, in that I have a limited awareness of gender to my body. And it's in that space of the unknown that they actually have, it's almost like synesthesia, right? Some people see sounds, right? Like I don't see sounds. But for somebody who has that experience, right, they have an expansive awareness of something that we don't. So we as cis folks are limited to like, what does it mean to feel male or female or even Jewish, right? Like not everybody has that sensation. Like you feel Jewish. I don't know. I've always been Jewish. This is how I feel, and I happen to be Jewish, right? But for other people who weren't born Jewish or others, there's a sensation, there's an awareness. So I do think that we find parallels to this in other places. This is not the only place where a person has an expanded awareness of a particular identity or experience. So knowing that we don't know is actually, I think, a higher level of awareness that we don't know it all.
Thanks. And one other thought on this area is So 18 and younger, people are not having surgery. They're on hormone blockers if their parents work with a child. Is that correct?
So generally speaking, and different communities have different kind of guidelines. And in some states, unfortunately, there's a lot of anti-trans legislation where it's really prohibited to do this, regardless of, I think for people who are anti-trans, it's not about being a child. It's about a person in America can't, have this kind of autonomy to make choices about their own body. The way in which reproductive rights, right, is not a function of age. It's about the government telling people what they can and can't do with their bodies. So generally speaking, if a child is looking to transition and they haven't yet started puberty, they're puberty blockers. There's a range within the medical community, but generally speaking, it's not for more than 4, sometimes 5 years. And then they have to make choices to either stop the blockers and allow the natural kind of puberty to kick in, or to do some sort of replacement for therapy of adding testosterone or other things to have a different part. Because before we are born, we all have the same working pieces and mechanisms of stuff, and then they develop in different ways, but it's core the same stuff. So it's really just a function of, which one's going to be dominant. And so people make different choices, and more people are electing to have fewer surgeries, because I think society can hold space for things that historically were either this or that. And now there's a recognition that actually there are a lot of different ways to be different people.
And that is wonderful. And I'm glad that we're talking about this because I think it's something that the cystic fibrosis community needs to be more aware of as well, because not only do you have a disease to deal with if you're in the trans or the gay community, but then you just have more to deal with, and everybody should be educated. I mean, every community, every group. But I wanted to also talk about this book. Is it Shaver Up? Is that how to pronounce it?
So I would pronounce it Chaver Up, but the word Chaver is the word that we use in Hebrew for ally in our community. It literally means friend. That's how colloquially it's used. In fact, when Yitzhak Rabin was killed, President Bill Clinton said Shalom, Chaver, like goodbye, friend, and that became a slogan, if you remember. But the word friend, there's the translation, but the word really more literally means connected. A chaver, like chibur, is like an author of a book is a mechaber, or something attached to the ground that's mechaber. So it's really about being connected, which is where the Latin source of the word ally comes from, like an alloy, like a ally, like alloy, like a mixture, like a binding, a blend. And so Judaism really, I think, imagines that we're so connected to each other that there is no other, right? Like if we want to have a relationship with God as a parent, like we need to take care of all of God's children as our siblings. And like, this is just not how you treat families. So it's a recognition of the resources and the needs, and making sure that people have what they need. And I think one of the main contributions that Judaism offers to the conversation about allyship is that it's less of a reaction to brokenness in society and more about a restoration to the ideal way of being. So for example, like if there's voter suppression, so we can try to schlep people to the polls, right? But that doesn't actually do anything to prevent it next year or to heal from the brokenness. So I think the ask is really to imagine, like, what is a world in which there is no oppression, right? There is no discrimination. There is no dehumanization. So this book, Cover Up, is actually 49 different rabbis from all the different denominations, all different identities, straight, queer, genderqueer folks, writing through kind of a modern lens of what it means to be an ally for them, to both receive allyship. And so we have a really powerful essay, might even be the first, the rabbi who has a daughter who has like severe medical issues, and what it means to advocate and to kind of be the person who's taking care, and then having another child who's genderqueer, and what that means to be an ally to that child in a very different way, right? Because there, it's not about being a spokesperson. It's really about listening. It's not about advocating. It's really about not occupying space. But that's part of the awkwardness of allyship, is it's this navigation of when am I present in a way that's helpful? When am I kind of invisible and that's helpful? So we wanted to really kind of amplify the voice of different people's experiences, to give people out in the world like an awareness of like how the spectrum is really vast and the gradations along it. It's also to recognize that we all need allies, right? None of us can do this work alone. And so we need people to be in conversation with us, to be supporting us, and we need to reciprocate as well.
Thanks for explaining that. I really appreciate it. And that was the reason Ann and I, my friend who you met, came to hear you speak, because it's so important to be allies. And that's what we want to do. And I encourage everyone to be an ally. I mean, and it's about advocating for anything, for anti-Semitism, for equal rights, for anything. But I just hope that more people do it in this space as well. And that leads me to my last question for you is, in addition to this podcast, how can we educate people more and make sure they're getting the right answers about the queer and straight and trans community?
So I think one thing is just to acknowledge the way in which there are many Jewish communities, are also many, trans and gender queer communities. So I think the most important thing is to start thinking locally. Does your, house of worship have an LGBT committee or club or representative? If they don't, that might be something to explore. I think it's always best to work with local folks and really relationship building. There's great organizations, PFLAG, right, which is for parents and friends of LGBT folks. But, speaking with who are the people who are doing this work already locally and asking them, like, what are the edges? What are the needs? Who's being successful? Where should I contribute? Where can I volunteer? Where are the places that need really work? But I would say particularly for Jewish organizations, Keshet, meaning Jewish organizations who are looking to do this work. There's a wonderful organization. It's a national organization. It's based in Boston. Keshet does a lot of training, and Keshet does a lot of, has a lot of resources. But speak to your faith-based, your faith leaders. And, if you want your sanctuary to be literally that safe space for people to be the most authentic version of themselves in relationship with other people and themselves and God, so you have to be proactive. And so if you don't see LGBT flags, if you don't see, stickers that say it's a safe space, if there's no representation, if you have a part of a big church, and nobody on the clergy team is, out as a member of the LGBT community, what kind of diversity does your house of worship, represent? Is the diversity reflected in its leadership, in the speakers, even if they're not on staff? Like, who do you, the books that you read in your book clubs, the organizations that you partner with, what kind of visibility, what kind of amplification of that first person narrative are you offering your platform to? So, and people can find me. There's a website, RabbiMikeMoskowitz.com. We're trying to update all the links to the articles, but there's a place to contact me. If anybody has particular questions, happy to continue the conversation, and just so grateful for the opportunity to be in conversation with you. And I hope that people benefit from it.
Thanks. Yeah. And I love your website too. And you know what? We have on our board for the Bonnell Foundation, one of our board members is queer. So I think that is another way, which you just made me think about, that representation on boards, advisory councils, all that stuff is really important too. So thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up here?
Thank you to the queer and genderqueer folks who are listening, particularly to trans youth. We see you. We love you. We need you. It does get better. And thank you for being. God doesn't put extra people in this world.
Amen. I have to say that, right? Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, Rabbi Moskowitz. Everybody check out his website. You're just a light in this world. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know what's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, visit our website at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's the BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical, The Science of Possibility, and Viatris. It was produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Follow our show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.